Welcome at the Advanced Materials Forum Europe. We are very excited to have you with us today at this 100% online event. To keep everybody safe and healthy during these times of Corona, we decided to record from people's homes. So, you will be listening to Marcus Remmers, the Chief Technology Officer of Royal DSM, from his home in Düsseldorf. Marcus will talk about how the next generation materials of DSM will help car manufacturers to develop cars that are cleaner, safer and smarter. If you have any questions during this session, please use the chat function and your question will be answered as soon as possible. After Marcus' talk, Marcus and I will deep dive into certain topics during a short Q&A. Over to Marcus.
Hi there. Did you know that Henry Ford was very passionate about cars built from renewable materials? He spent millions and hours and months in his lab to establish a prototype of a car entirely built from renewable materials. And he actually managed to do that in 1941 with a prototype car, which was made fun of, and people said, oh, this is part salad, part automotive. Newspapers sprang the story and they were actually telling jokes about it. Meet two farmers. One farmer says, what are you growing this year? Chryslers or Fords? Says the other, well, if it doesn't start raining soon, all I'll be growing this year is mini Austins. But joking aside, I think the need for renewable material for sustainability in the industry is perhaps higher today than it ever was. And we're clearly looking at different ways to make that happen. Now, Ford's car in 1941 was lighter and renewable, but it was lacking other critical aspects that, of course, you need for a car, including the strength. And even though the newspapers were fast to recommend to Henry Ford to add spinach to the mix to make the car stronger, it eventually got forgotten in the 40s. My name is Marcus Remmers. I am Chief Technology Officer here at DSM, and I want to share with you today a couple of thoughts and reflections on how we see the worlds of automotive and materials evolving, how can we work together, what we can contribute, and how we see this specifically panning out in the future of many uncertainties. People say it's the VUCA world, VUCA standing for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Now, I would argue what it takes to succeed in a VUCA world is a company to embrace VUCA 2.0. What is VUCA 2.0? What I mean with this is you need to be visionary, you need to be understanding, you need to be courageous, and you certainly need to be adaptive. Now, if you bring this together in this mix, preferably along the entire value chain from materials to modules to the entire car, I think we have a way to play our cards well in this world where you have automotive, autonomous driving, where you have shared business models and shared ownership models, electronics, every area you have massive trends that of course have impact on the automotive industry and all the different parts. And we thought that through on what it means for every part and how can we redesign things in ways that they are more sustainable in addressing the various needs. Specifically, I want to discuss this with you in 3 chapters. First of all, the powering of the cars, and that means electrification, hydrogen. What does it mean? What impact would it have from a materials perspective? Secondly, the manufacturing, back to the salad car, how can sustainability aspects help to make the jump for the manufacturing of the future? And lastly, connectivity, because we see electronics being one of the biggest drivers and also there that will have an impact on materials. So let's jump right into it. Powering the car of the future. Now, about a quarter of all carbon dioxide emitted by mankind comes from the transportation industry, that's automotive and aviation. So in times of global warming and the Paris Treaty, we clearly together have to look for alternatives and see if we can find alternatives to the conventional combustion engine. Now, to be clear, as you know, the combustion engine is not going anywhere. There will always be a segment of specific customers that need this, but we clearly also see the emergence of alternative power sources, primarily electric, of course, hydrogen. German automotive industry is looking into this. And then you've got a little more exotic aspects like ammonium and others. But maybe let's look at hydrogen first. And I'll tell you a story about this that really made a difference for me. A couple of months ago, I was at the MIT in Boston. We have a partnership there. And I saw in beta testing a hydrogen gas station. And what I always thought is hydrogen will be limited by the infrastructure around it. Until we've got all the hydrogen pipelines and generation and all the rest of it, a lot of things will happen. But what I've seen there was a unit that was, I'd say, 3 meters wide, 2 meters thick, 2 meters high, which was essentially a filling station for one hydrogen car. But the kicker is, the only thing that went into this unit was electricity cable and a water line of this diameter. And what the unit did continuously over time was hydrolyzing, or do the hydrolysis of the water into hydrogen and oxygen, and stored the hydrogen in the unit. So as you drive by the car, you would have the pressure transfer of the hydrogen at about the same speed that you go to a normal gas station. Now, if you think of it, that could be a game changer for hydrogen, because suddenly you don't have to dig pipelines of explosive hydrogen all over the place. So I was very much intrigued by that. And of course, if you look to what does hydrogen mean for the car, about 70% of all materials in the car are on one way or another related to the engine, or I'd say under the hood, of course. So if you change the combustion engine, there will be massive implications for the materials. And from the hydrogen perspective, what you need, of course, is storage. Of course, it's a safety aspect that you have to take very seriously. And that's where our scientists have spent a lot of time to understand to what extent, what does it take to build materials that keep hydrogen according to the specifications. And I'm very pleased to say we've actually launched the first materials and the first hydrogen tanks together with some of our partners. And we're clearly looking into further opportunities to work with you and identify other applications where the tubing and the other elements of a hydrogen-powered part can be reinvented and brought to scale at reasonable cost. Electricity is, of course, the mainstream. Now, in 2019, we sold about 2 million or so electric cars, but that's projected to go up to almost 20 million by 2025 and then further up from there. Now, still, the number of vehicles on the road, either fully electric or hybrids, will, of course, grow a little slower. I think 20 million would represent about 20% of all new vehicles in 2025, including hybrids, which means still only 5% of the cars on the road by then globally will have somewhat of electric engine. But again, we see this increasing very quickly, and now is the time to think of what it means for materials, what it also means for the electric grid. Coming back to the electric grid and the infrastructure around it, that's a little more, I would say, straightforward than hydrogen, but with investment in renewable energy sources and all the rest of it. But one of the aspects that's often overlooked is the need that you also need to transport the electricity to where it's needed, and the electric grid and the extension thereof may very well quickly become the limiting factor. In all the models, you see very quickly that building new electric power lines the planning, the implementation takes quite a while. And instead, suddenly the battery collectively in all electric cars can become an interesting factor in storing renewable energy that's generated during the day and needed at night. So there's a very interesting interplay of electric cars, not only for mobility, but in general for the switch to electrification. Now, what it means for materials again, in the DSM portfolio, we've got quite a few materials in the electronic sector, cable, connectors, and all these aspects, which of course would be interesting as materials when we look at design or redesign or co-design of what does it take to make an electric vehicle even lighter or even more efficient. And on top of this, I would add the notion, of course, DSM being very strongly committed to the purpose of sustainability. We're proud to sponsor also experimental vehicles. We've been sponsoring the TU Delft, which is participating in these huge solar-powered car races. So they've actually won for the last 7 years consecutively the big competition to cross Australia, 3,000 miles, purely on solar energy. And they can build on the expertise of our solar business, as well as, of course, the expertise of our material scientists to make the materials light and durable. And we're also proud to push it a step further and begin very soon to announce a partnership with a company that builds lightweight cars with about 5 square meters solar cells on top that have no other electric plug-in. You can drive this entirely with electric energy generated by the car, or maybe you plug it in, but it's designed such that it essentially powers itself. So we see a lot of changes in the powering, many different options. It's not clear which will win. Chances are we'll see a lot of segments that have their way, and we need to get ready for all of them. And we believe with very deep scientific knowledge and materials that we can partner with to address solutions that we need in these aspects. Now, the next thing I want to discuss with you is the production of the car of the future. Now, we just talked about the first mega trend, which is climate change, and with that, the need to reduce the carbon footprint, driving the need for alternatives for the combustion engine. Another mega trend that has a big impact is resource scarcity, and with this, the need for recycling. Now, if you look at a car 50 years ago, in 1970, it would be made out about 80% metal. And metal, of course, is the ideal material for recycling because you can recycle it unlimited without losing the properties of the steel, which is, of course, fantastic. Now, in the 70s, one car would be about 980 kilos, about a ton. Today, an average car weighs 1,650 kilos and has only 60% metal in it. And the increase is essentially plastic materials from about 5% to about a little more than 20%. And recycling plastic is, as you all know, very challenging because you need to come back to the exact same material, but in a car you've got 10, 20, 30 different materials of polymer backbones, not to speak enough to the fillers and the composites. So we have a bit of a dilemma here between saving weight by increasing the plastic, but then as you do it, you have a lightweight car that uses, less fuel, but then you've got a recycling issue on the other side. That's something where I think an integrated design can help, and where we can work together to see how can we increase the circularity of a material to ensure for easier recycling. If you look a little closer, where will future replacements take place and what will happen in the car when it comes to plastic replacement. Future growth is anticipated primarily in the interior trim, with specific materials for haptics and consumer convenience inside. And you can expect a decrease of plastics under the hood, with the decrease, of course, of combustion engines over time. Things like fuel systems and other aspects where you have plastics today. At the same time, we see the performance of some plastics materials increasing, going into metal replacement areas that were previously unthinkable. DSM, for example, has developed a torsion bar, where you would think that's about the last place where metal would go because of the extreme mechanical requirements that you have. But we've actually shown that with some of our polyamide composites in very specific ways, we can produce torsion bars which are a fraction of the weight of a metal torsion bar, but have the same functionality. So we see when it comes to manufacturing, the question of metal versus plastic, and specifically then how can we keep up the circularity. And again, that's an exciting area where plenty of things are moving, and we'd love to partner with you to figure out the specific needs and the specific offerings that we have to make that work. But it's not only the materials that will potentially disrupt and change the way cars are manufactured, it's also the methodology on how cars are made. And in this case, I'm thinking specifically of the potential of additive manufacturing that has the potential to disrupt different aspects there. Now, additive manufacturing is something that we're particularly passionate about. We have an emerging business unit that is specifically focused on that, and not only on the materials that we provide to you, but also, and more importantly, on the know-how, on the design, on bringing the different software, hardware, and materials aspects together as a unit that allows you to come up with new and innovative solutions. Now, let's talk about the perspectives of additive manufacturing. We're actually working together with Toyota Motorsports and explore the potential of additive manufacturing in cars which are produced in low overall numbers, but to very specific specifications. And there, of course, additive manufacturing is ideal because you can put in an individual design and see very quickly what comes out, produce it without the need for cumbersome individual metal part engineering, and introduce these parts into the car and run with it. And at the moment you have an idea on how to improve things, you don't have to grab a new series, you can immediately come up with a new part and put it in. But it also goes a step further when you look at the mass market, because if you look at replacement plastic parts, there are mile-long shelves all over the world that have all specific replacement parts sitting there in case somebody asked for, a replacement exhaust or whatever it is, part of a certain car, which may never be called for. However, with additive manufacturing, you can imagine just having a bag of resin in the corner of the dealerships, and all you need to know is to download the specific 3D file of the replacement part, print it out real quick and put it in, and the supply chain cost and the cost of complexity for the entire system that you can save are of course enormous. Also, what you see with additive manufacturing, it's much easier to make molds and other parts that you need for the manufacturing that you can mass customize and address very quickly and more effectively. Speaking of mass customization, there may even be another business model in here. Think what Harley Davidson has done and generated significant part of their profits. They activated the community of the Harley fans to come up with new metal designs, new crazy long steering wheels, different types of footrests that were essentially designed by the customer and then produced by Harley and sold to their very specific loyal customer base at enormous prices and high profitability. Everybody was happy. Why not consider certain parts of the interior trim and let your customers come up with ideas on how to redesign, on how to change the form, the color, and come up with some crazy individualized ways to play with your interior design. BMW Mini plays with this business model, and there's a lot of really interesting and fascinating ideas there for everyone to look into and say, maybe there's something where we can use this technology as a bridge for a new business model in a very quickly changing world and increase the loyalty of our customers, buy into their creativity, and mass customize parts of the interiors of our cars. Now, there's one other aspect where technology and materials, I think, can disrupt manufacturing. If you follow the money, if you look at what are the most expensive parts in the manufacturing process, one of the most expensive parts, you know it, is the painting, because it's very energy intense. It's, you know, the painting on a car is a very, very high-tech product of many, many, many different layers that have to come out perfect, have the perfect adhesion to the metal, and have to essentially have all these different properties to come up with the solution the customer expects. Now, DSM has been looking into this specifically in our resins division, and we've come up with ways to simplify the process and design resins that bring together multiple layers and simplify the process and speed it up, that could reduce your manufacturing cost in that specific aspect by 20%, because these resins dry faster, you have a higher throughput, and they are more reliable. So also in this case, there is lots of technology that can disrupt and improve your cost position. Happy to discuss this further with you. Thirdly and lastly, I want to talk about connecting the car of the future. We talked about climate change, circularity, but there are two other major trends which are even closer immediately to the automotive industry, and that's autonomous driving and shared ownership models. Now, if you look at these two things, you can develop a matrix of four segments between owned, self-owned and shared, and autonomous versus self-driving. On the one hand, on the one extreme, you have self-owned, self-driven. That's my car, that's right there in the garage. To shared autonomous. That's essentially the Uber that I will call one day from my cell phone. A car shows up with no driver in it. I get in, tell the app where I want to go, I get out, and the car goes its merry way afterwards to somebody else. Or buses, same principle. And then there are the other two scenarios, which is self-owned but autonomous driving. So eventually my car will be able to do the driving itself, even though I still sit at the steering wheel. Or shared but self-driven. That's the in Germany, you have this in the major cities, a lot of the minis standing around where you have a cell phone app. You just reserve the car, you go in, you drive, and you pay for every mile you drive. Now, from a connectivity perspective, of course, there's big challenges there in the context of the autonomous driving, 5G, all the rest of it. But the question first is, which of these four segments will win? Where's the end game? Which segments will be prevailing in what contexts? And I would argue there will always be something around self-owned, self-driven. Certainly in the rural areas, there's no replacement for this kind of thing. But certainly in urban cities, what you see a lot is, and already more, from shared self-driving to eventually then shared autonomous driving, which I would argue will probably prevail very quickly in the urban centers. And then these two other scenarios eventually would see where that goes. Now, what does it mean from a materials perspective if you suddenly look at shared models? You have to suddenly look at materials that look at biofilms or hygiene. You have to look at interiors that make the vehicle a driving entertainment center, which effectively is, I think, the way you have to look at it at some point, because the trend of electronics coming up. And of course, what does that mean again for connectivity? It means you want your streaming internet, you want the music that you can hear, you want your data, you want everything available in the car, and preferably not through your cell phone connection, but through a car connection. And let's also be clear, there's a major challenge around cybersecurity. You want this whole thing to be safe and secure, to avoid a hacker getting in your car and getting in a place where you don't want to go. All of these challenges, I think we all are wrestling with and trying to figure out which will be the final scenario and what does it take to get there. And also, again, putting the different elements of the value chain together. How can we complement each other and look at the design of such a new vehicle through new eyes? Can we come up, given the different requirements here, to come up with a car with only one polymer, to avoid multiple polymers, and this way have the recycling of this much simplified? Maybe it's not going to be perfect for every application, but maybe it's good enough if we make it a thicker here and a little longer there, so that you only have one material, which would, of course, make this very desirable from a recycling perspective. So the connectivity in this whole thing, of course, links the electronic industry with the automotive industry. And that's, again, an area where DSM has a particular strength in our current materials division. So very happy that these areas come together, because we bring experience in those both fields and can offer solutions with you for materials that have particularly good isolating properties or shielding properties or conducting properties to ensure the connectors come together. For example, in the major, what I would call cable challenge, today that there's kilometers of cable in the car, which are very difficult to install and then also very difficult to recycle. They're heavy, and if we could replace them through wireless signal transfer or some way of maybe printed electricity under the roof of the car, for example, would be able to disrupt the current way we look at manufacturing of cars. But nobody can do that alone. There's different disciplines. There's materials people required, there's engineering required, there's a different element from the software and the hardware that all need to come together. And I would argue, let's create these alliances to rethink the connectivity of the car and enable it to be fit for the future.
Well, thank you, Marcus, for this very insightful story. You made it for me very clear that the car industry is changing at an enormous pace, a pace we've never seen before, and I think it's really exciting. So you touched upon some points that I would like to deep dive into a little bit more. And one thing actually that triggered me a lot is the fact that you talked about additive manufacturing, creating the opportunity for customers to, or basically to customize their car. And I was wondering, if you could customize something in your car, what would be the first thing you would customize?
Oh, hi, Paul. First of all, that's a good one. I think the first thing that I would do is ask my teenage daughters, 14 and 16, because they always have some stuff in the car that they want differently, and they probably would have some ideas about how to change the colors and the look and feel of certain things. If you would ask me, apart from the aesthetics, which would be cool to change every now and then to have another look and feel in the car, I would probably, I've got a chronic, this peculiar thing how I want my arms while I drive, specifically with the steering wheel. It could be too high and too low, and my arms are long and all. So for that, it could be cool to have something on the door which is really adjusted to my specific settings. But that would be pretty cool if somebody could say, hey, yeah, you know, that's your customized cockpit here.
Cool. And do you think we would ever be in a situation where people would almost be able to design their own car? Or is that one bridge too far?
I think the entire car is, I don't know, it's probably a bridge too far, because you've got all these things, you know, in the platform under the hood that you don't really care about. But the things that you do care about, why not give more power to the customer to design? Again, I loved when I heard the story of Harley Davidson. They almost made more money with the customization that their customers actually told them than with the motorbike. Or what you see even now with Tesla, they have customers coming to them and say, hey, you know, we have this dog problem, and in summer, you know, the poor dog is sitting in the car, and then can't you do something? And as a result of these custom ideas, they then came up with the dog mode, which is now an update that everybody has in their car, where you can have the air conditioning at a certain level that even in hot days, the windows are a crack open and the dog is very safe. So, I mean, when you start the dynamic where your customers tell you what to do, I think that's very powerful. It opens avenues for new revenue and new business models. And 3D printing, I think, is a super powerful enabler to that. So just, you know, a little bit of food for thought, maybe play around with it.
Okay, thank you. Another question that I wanted to ask you is about the VUCA world we live in. Because you have explained that we are entering an era where you can talk about VUCA 2.0, which is about vision, understanding, courage, and adaptability. I was actually triggered by the word adaptability, because if you look at adaptability at DSM is quite large. And with the fast pace of change in automotive, I was actually wondering, how does a giant company like DSM ensures that it really stays flexible enough to adapt to all these new developments, like these developments that you just mentioned about 3D printing and designing your own part?
Yeah, that's a big challenge. And of course, the bigger a company gets, I think the more you wrestle with fixed structures that are there. One of the things that specifically, I think DSM noted is you can have the model of a super tanker. That's fundamentally a very strong model, because it's a very strong direction that you take. You have a lot of power, you direct it and you move in a certain way. But the problem is, of course, in the VUCA world, particularly to your point on adaptability, super tankers are not exactly as agile as you perhaps want to be. And the counter model to the super tanker, which we talk about a lot in DSM, is the model of a flotilla, where you set the direction as the corporation, where everybody goes, but you also empower the different units to the right level down to whatever the appropriate level is, to take their right decisions, to set the sails, to get where we all need to be in the best way, and allow them to take the twists and turns as it's optimal. And a good example we talked about already is in fact our 3D printing group. That's a group that we set apart from the big corporation to allow them and enable them to do what's right for them and do some unusual thinking and try things out without the constraints of all the big guidelines. Of course, as long as the certain basic fundamentals of safety and sustainability, of course, are covered. But that's particularly, I think, interesting for 3D printing, because in this area, I touched on it before, what I find so unique is you have the materials people getting into the space of 3D printing. That's originally where we're coming from. But you also have the hardware people coming in, which is the people that build the 3D printers. And then you have the software people coming into that same space, which of course play a key role in designing things and make it happen. And then the magic happens at the interface. And then the question is, who will win this game? Who will ultimately be the most customer friendly person? Is it the materials people or the other two? And I think The notion ultimately what makes more sense these days, looking again at VUCA 2.0, it's not one, but it's really ecospheres of people that come together, that complement themselves, coming from a strong foundation that they themselves have. Put the customer at the center of it, try things out and go fast. And that's, I think, what we do a lot with our 3D printing group. And I'm pretty excited about it. And what we hear in the background, by the way, is the coffee brewing for my family. Maybe if you want a coffee as well, I can offer you one.
That sounds really good. We'd love to have it. Yeah, we're all working from home these days with the COVID-19 situation. So of course, people are for themselves. Hope you enjoy it. Well, yeah, interesting what you say about the intersection of where people come together and where they need to collaborate, because that requires also something from people, right? People need to have different skills, different mindset. Well, you talked about VUCA 2.0, but do you then also need to talk about scientists 2.0? Do we need a different type of scientist, do you say?
I think yes, from a number of perspectives. So the first point I'd say is we can never let go of the fundamentals, and particularly DSM is very strong in the notion of our scientific competence is at the backbone of everything we do, and the scientific competence is our entry ticket to be even an attractive partner for others. Because if I talk to somebody, I pick the people that know what they're talking about, and I want to be picked because people come to me because our scientists have a strong and broad foundation. And of course, what is unique about DSM is also the fact that we've got a very broad portfolio from nutrition, biotechnology, but also biomedical, but then of course the material space, macromolecular chemistry, analytical. All of these aspects are part of the DSM group, and that allows us to do things that few people can, which is bring together the competences in these areas. I mentioned biomedical, for example. I'm super excited about the idea that the insights that our experts have on how bacteria grow on surfaces, which is something that you need for implants in your body, why not use this and bring them together in designing new surfaces for the interior of a car? And we design our internal competence platforms very much in a way that they go cross-company. That's the very center of this, because we want to avoid that people sit in their own little silo and only do what they do. So back to your question, do we need new scientists? I think we need scientists that are strong in the core, but are even more willing and able to connect with others inside and outside the company, and maybe downside the value chain, putting the customer at the center. And I think that's perhaps a journey that I'd be super excited about with the people that are perhaps watching.
Okay, and then you mentioned the value chain. So people need to be open to collaborate more with partners in the value chain. How do you actually look at that? When you look at DSM, do you only look at partners in the value chain? Do you look at adjacent functions maybe? For instance, I was triggered by your story about connected cars, where you said, you've got connected cars. It's becoming more and more important or it's becoming more and more a trend. But that would also mean that when you have 5G, we need very strong 5G connectivity. Does that mean that companies like DSM, the automotive industry, and ICT suppliers need to collaborate together and form bonds in move that process further?
Absolutely. I really think this is critical to overcome the conventional thinking of this is my core and this is my competitor and I do this and you don't do that. For example, DSM is very active in the coalition for low emissions of the chemical industry, where we look across the industry for ways to shape and reshape and redesign the way we work towards longer term low emissions, because we all, DSM, as you know, has science-based targets to reduce our emissions by 30% until 2030, but that's not the end game. We need to go even further and think more radically on how we redesign some of the processes? Can we electrify crackers? Can we do this, that, and the other? And in that context, questions like the electric grid or energy carriers like hydrogen or questions of connectivity are very much at the center of the discussion, and it becomes very quickly clear if you want to make a difference. And I would argue that's very much a parallel to the automotive industry. If you want to make a difference with all these uncertainties and all these options and still make an impact, you have to really work together in more open and different ways. In the pre-competitive space, of course, in ways that in all clarity respect, the legal requirements of antitrust law. But I think in that space, there's quite a lot happening, and we try to be very much engaged with it. Let me say one more thing to get closer to the partners. DSM is, for example, part of the Arena 25 project in Stuttgart, which is really an open forum where partners from the automotive industry, but also other players along the value chain come together, experiment, try things out, and have a good exchange about what are the challenges and who can contribute what part. And being a materials player in a discussion where typically engineers are sitting that talk about the challenges of the electric car or whatever is super exciting, because that's, I think, where really innovation gets generated if we are together talking about this is the underlying problem, and together we can design this property or this backbone or whatever it may be.
So it's about collaboration. I mean, in your talk, but also in the answers to these questions, I hear a lot. You say a lot about collaboration, and no one can do it alone. You have to collaborate and form bonds to do that. But what is then the binding factor of all these different companies and different partners working together? Am I correct to say that that's sustainability? That sustainability is the glue of all these partners working together?
I'd say the glue of everything is the customer, because that's, I think, clearly what we need to center around. And the customer, I think, these days is in fact driven by aspects of sustainability. People want to feel good about themselves and sit in a car where they know or use products or consume products, where they know this is something that is sustainably produced or something that has its contribution to global warming or whatever it may be. And I also have an opportunity as we design these things together to bake it into the solution from day one, which is another important aspect.
Yeah. And if you talk about the customer, you might talk about the end customer, like the persons who buy the cars. But if I look at the customer of DSM, that's the car manufacturers. If you look at their wishes, they are also looking into sustainability options, and they want to make clear how they contribute to a more sustainable world. But at DSM, you do life cycle assessments. And you also talked about closed-to-loop recycling. So I was just wondering, can you help your customers, so the car manufacturers, with their product life cycle assessments? Is that an offer that DSM can bring to their customers?
Yeah, that's a good point that you bring up, life cycle assessments, because the question very often is then, when you have two options, which one is the more sustainable? And it's not as easy as it may appear, because to your point, you have to look at it holistically. Very quickly, you come to the question of, would I rather have a water-intense process with, long lifetimes, or something less intense with fewer lifetimes? There's many parameters, and then very quickly you end up in tricky decisions and discussions about how do you weigh the different aspects of sustainability. There is no, at this stage, at least I'm not aware of any objective industry standard that would define exactly how a life cycle assessment works. But many people are working on it, and as DSM, we try to be a leader and bring people together. We've established our own, what we call bright living solutions. This is our own starting point and proposal for life cycle assessment in all the spaces that we're active in. And certainly we would love to engage with people down this chain or everybody else to compare what are you doing, what can we learn from each other, and can we come to better standards that are more broadly accepted. Because the reality is at this stage, even our shareholders, not only our stakeholders, our shareholders are demanding objective life cycle assessment numbers. And as an industry, the more we can agree on strong standards that are transparent, the better we will all be seen by the capital markets.
And I'm still curious about that sustainability aspect. So you say life cycle assessments, that you can assess whether or not you make sustainable choices. You can sometimes go different routes, and then they can all be sustainable, but it's difficult to compare them. It's sometimes maybe apples and oranges to compare them. But if you I wanted to compare hydrogen with electric driving, because I have a neighbor who's driving electric and I have a neighbor who's driving hybrid. Hardly dare to say, but I still drive diesel. I don't know anybody who's driving hydrogen at the moment, but I was just wondering, if you look, let's say, 30 years ahead from now, whether it will be hydrogen or electric, what do you think is the most sustainable option? So not looking at what is possible from a technology standpoint, but from a sustainability option, what do you hope that will be the future of, in the automotive industry?
Oh, that's a tough one. I think the simple answer, ultimately, this is a political decision, because the politics will decide on major infrastructure investments that will have to be necessary for one or the other or both. If you look at it through trying to be very objective from a pure science based, and you look at thermodynamics and the efficiency of the two, if that's your baseline, you will find if you have electricity maybe from a green source, you put it in a battery and you run an electric car, you get a total efficiency that's pretty high. I would say almost 70% or something like that, because you keep the electricity on the road. Obviously, you lose something as you turn it into motion in the engine and a little bit in the storage, but overall it's pretty efficient. The moment you turn electrons into protons, or in other words, the moment you use the electricity to generate hydrogen, you have enormous losses. Number one, the electrolysis of water still is a pretty inefficient process, and there's limits of thermodynamics that will always have it relatively inefficient. And then the moment you burn the hydrogen to water and release the energy and turn that into motion is again a pretty inefficient process. So if you do the math, you end up, I think, of about 13% efficiency. If you start with green energy, turn it into hydrogen, turn it into power, and turn this into motion. So 13 versus 70 is a pretty obvious thing that you say. A hydrogen car from that perspective does not make a whole lot of sense. But you have to see it in a broader perspective, because again, infrastructure is critical, and it's probably easier these days to put a hydrogen pipeline in than a new electric grid. So plus there's more things that you can do with hydrogen, and there's other things that you can do with electricity. So it's a bit of a broader discussion. But I think the one point that I think all users should keep in mind, the more you turn electricity into other materials, i.e. electrolysis, the more you have dramatic losses in the efficiency. So we should try to use it as straight as we can to be as efficient as we can.
Okay. But for now, you are driving electric. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's my. I mean, I started years ago when we were still living in the US. I was driving a German car, actually Porsche, and then at some point I said, let's try electric, and I changed it into a very small electric car, and everybody laughed at me, but my kids loved it. They called it the Harry Potter car because it seems to move magically. There's no sound. It's got a nice kick to it. So we now upgraded to a Tesla, and it's apart from the fact that the engineering is fun. I think the feeling of electric, to me personally, and that's a very subjective point, of course, it's pretty unique. So I'm certainly a big proponent of it.
Okay. Well, I think we can talk for hours about this, and I have much more questions to ask. But unfortunately, we've come to the end of this session today. So for me, it has been extremely insightful, and I hope for the audience as well. Is there any last comment that you would like to share with the people online?
I think to summarize, if you look at the world through the lens of automotive, it's extremely challenging times because there's clearly the old world is clear will not continue as it is, but the new world is not clear yet. And in these times, you really have to keep all your options open, which is a costly process. You have to wonder what are the new competencies that you need, how can you cope and bet on the right horses. And typically the best strategy in this is to keep your options open and to collaborate with people that can help you along the way. So I would certainly hope from DSM that we've shown that we've got many different aspects where we can be a good partner, and we'd love to engage with more and more people to see how can we together create this future which is desirable for everyone. And I think it's going to be an exciting process, and I certainly look forward to that.
Okay, and I think everybody online as well. We all look forward to a bright future together. Well, that leaves me with thanking you for your inspiration today and thanking the audience for joining. So thank you all and enjoy the rest of your conference.